I watched the ink dry on the thick, cream-colored legal paper. Just a few strokes of a Mont Blanc pen, and it was done. My husband, Marcus, the man I had shared a bed with for 15 years, looked up at me with a smirk that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He had just successfully maneuvered me out of our multi-million-dollar real estate business, our custom-built mansion, and our luxury cars. He thought he had left me with absolutely nothing. He thought he had won the game. He had no idea that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. But to understand how a seemingly defeated housewife orchestrated the most lethal, quiet destruction of a narcissist's empire, you need to understand the board we were playing on. My name is Evelyn. I'm 35 years old, and for a decade and a half, I was the invisible architect behind Marcus Sterling's success. People looked at us and saw the American dream dipped in gold. We met when I was 20, and he was 26. He had the charm of a politician and the ambition of a shark. I had a sharp mind for numbers, an inheritance from my late father that I fiercely protected, and a naive belief that a marriage was a partnership. For 11 years, I was his unpaid CFO, his crisis manager, and his ghostwriter. I balanced the books that built his first development project. I smiled at the galas, pouring champagne for investors while making sure our own accounts stayed in the green. I was the sturdy foundation, and he was the shiny penthouse everyone admired. But somewhere along the way, the penthouse forgot it needed a foundation. He started staying out late. The scent of foreign perfume lingered on his tailored suits. His criticisms of me grew sharper. My clothes were too safe, my ambition was too small, my presence was too boring. He was building an empire, he said, and I was just keeping the desk warm. I could have screamed. I could have thrown plates. But my father always taught me, when a storm is coming, you don't yell at the clouds. You build a bunker. The real storm didn't hit until a rainy Tuesday night, 3 years before that final day in court. Marcus was supposedly in Chicago for a conference. I was in his home office, searching for a misfiled tax document. His private safe, usually locked with a code he thought I didn't know, was left slightly ajar. Careless. Arrogance makes people careless. Inside, I didn't just find a tax document. I found a parallel universe. There were statements from offshore accounts I had never seen, lines of credit opened against our supposedly paid-off home, 3 separate mortgages. I sat on the Persian rug at 2 a.m., my heart hammering against my ribs as I did the terrifying math. The business wasn't thriving, as it was bleeding out. Cryptocurrency gambles, $300,000 vanished. High-stakes poker debts in Vegas, $150,000. A luxury condo leased downtown, clearly not for business, considering the $80,000 spent on designer furniture and jewelry for a woman named Chloe. Our net worth wasn't the sparkling $4 million Marcus bragged about at the country club. We were swimming in $2.5 million of hidden toxic debt. My husband was a walking, talking Ponzi scheme in an Armani suit. My first instinct was rage, pure, a blinding rage. I wanted to wake up our teenage son, pack our bags, and scorch the earth on my way out. I wanted to hire the most vicious lawyer in the state and expose him. But as I sat there, clutching the papers that proved my life was a lie, a chilling realization washed over me. If I exposed him now, the explosion would take me down with him. In a standard divorce, the court would split the assets, but they would also split the liabilities. I would be legally bound to pay off half of his gambling debts, half of his mistress's condo. It would wipe out my personal savings and destroy my son's future. I couldn't just walk away. I had to let him push me out. I had to make him demand to take everything, debts included, without him realizing the trap he was stepping into. I carefully placed the documents back in the safe, exactly as I found them. I closed the heavy steel door, hearing the lock click into place. The crying was over. The game of cat and mouse had just begun, and I had 3 years to build the perfect maze. For the next 3 years, I became an actress worthy of an Academy Award. You have no idea how much physical strength it takes to smile at a man who is actively destroying your life. Every morning, I poured his black coffee. Every evening, I asked how his day at the firm was. I listened to him complain about the stress of providing for our lavish lifestyle, all while knowing his offshore accounts were draining our actual assets dry. He thought I was clueless. He thought I was just a comfortable piece of furniture in his grand, gold-plated life, and I needed him to keep believing exactly that. About 6 months after my discovery in his safe, Marcus decided to turn up the heat. He didn't just want to live a double life anymore. He wanted to push me out. But because he was a narcissist, he couldn't just leave. He had to make it look like I was the problem. He needed to break me down so completely that when the time came, I wouldn't have the strength to fight for a single dime. The psychological warfare started small. He canceled my personal credit card, claiming we needed to consolidate finances for a new investment. I smiled and agreed. Then he started bringing her around. Chloe. She was 26 with perfectly highlighted hair and yoga pants that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. He introduced her as his new executive assistant. He started inviting her to our home for late-night strategy sessions. They would sit on my custom-ordered Italian leather sofa, drinking my expensive wine, while I brought them charcuterie boards. He would put his hand on her shoulder, right in front of me, discussing market trends, waiting for me to snap, waiting for me to throw a glass, waiting for me to give him the excuse he needed to call me crazy and unstable. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I just politely asked if they needed more prosciutto. I played the role of the oblivious, submissive wife so perfectly that even his mother, who had always treated me like the hired help, started looking at me with genuine pity. But while they were playing house in my living room, I was quietly building a fortress in the shadows. You see, my grandmother, before she passed away, had left me an inheritance. $500,000. Her dying words to me were, "A smart woman always keeps her own money, not secret money, just hers." For years, it had sat in a separate account, untouched, legally protected as my sole property. But I knew Marcus. If things got ugly, if he realized he was drowning, he would try to drag my inheritance down with him to pay off his debts. He would claim it was marital property used for the household. I couldn't risk it. So, I didn't hire a divorce lawyer. Not yet. I hired a trust and estate attorney 3 towns over. A quiet, terrifyingly smart woman named Eleanor, who charged a fortune and asked 0 unnecessary questions. Together, we set up an irrevocable trust in my son's name. It was an ironclad, impenetrable legal vault. I moved every single penny of my inheritance, along with my personal IRA from my early working days, straight into that trust. My name wasn't on it as a beneficiary. Marcus's name certainly wasn't on it. It was completely untouchable. By year 2, Marcus's arrogance had morphed into full-blown recklessness. He started openly criticizing me in front of our friends. My dinners were bland. My clothes were outdated. My lack of ambition was stifling his growth. I was running his entire back office for free, raising our son, and managing a 6,000 square foot house. But sure, I lacked ambition. I let him win every argument. I apologized when I didn't need to. I made myself smaller, quieter, and seemingly more dependent. And because people stop watching you when they underestimate you, I was able to gather everything. Every Tuesday, while he was working late, I meticulously scanned the new bank statements. I updated the encrypted hard drive hidden in a false bottom of my gardening toolkit. I tracked the new loans he took out against his failing business. I watched the $2.5 million of toxic debt swell closer to $3 million. The hole he was digging was becoming a crater. I just had to wait for him to jump in. And then, 3 months ago, it happened. The moment I had spent over 1,000 agonizing days preparing for. It was a Thursday evening. I was making his favorite dinner, chicken piccata, because apparently I am a glutton for unappreciated effort. He walked into the kitchen, wearing a brand new $15,000 Rolex he had bought with company funds, and sat at the island. He didn't look sad. He didn't look apologetic. He looked like a CEO firing a mid-level employee. "I want a divorce," he said, tapping his fingers on the marble countertop. I stopped stirring the sauce. I let my shoulders slump. I forced a slight tremble into my hands. "Marcus." "Why?" I whispered, staring at the floor. "We've grown apart, Evelyn. You're holding me back," he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed sincerity. And then came the hook, the ultimatum he had been building up to for years. "I've spoken to my lawyers. I want the house. I want the business. I want the cars. I built this empire, Evelyn, and I'm not letting you take half of it just because you signed a marriage license. You can keep your personal belongings, and I'll give you a small cash payout to start over. But the assets stay with me." He said it like he was ordering from a menu. "I'll have the empire, hold the wife." He wanted to leave me with nothing. He wanted to strip me bare and watch me walk out of the house I built into the cold. I looked up at him, tears welling in my eyes exactly on cue. What he saw was a broken woman, completely crushed by the weight of his power. What he didn't see was the screaming, victorious laughter echoing in my mind. He demanded the assets. He was actually demanding the debt. He just didn't know it yet. Before we even reached the mediation table, the humiliation had to reach its absolute peak. Once Marcus officially asked for the divorce and demanded the assets, he completely stopped pretending. He moved me into the small guest room down the hall. But that wasn't enough. He needed Chloe to start marking her territory while I was still trapped under that roof. It happened on a Saturday. I had taken our son Leo to a baseball game just to get him out of that toxic house for a few hours. When we walked back through the front door, the smell of fresh chemical paint hit me like a physical blow. I walked into the kitchen, my sanctuary, the place where I had taught Leo how to bake cookies, where I had sat up late paying Marcus's early business bills, the place I had painstakingly designed with warm sage green cabinets. It was gone. Chloe was standing there in her designer athletic wear, holding a cup of my favorite artisanal tea. Watching workers paint my beautiful sage cabinets a sterile, soulless builder-grade gray. But that wasn't the part that broke my heart. Sitting by the back door was a garbage bag. Peeking out from the top of the black plastic was my grandmother's vintage wooden recipe box, the one she had hand-carved, the one Chloe had decided didn't fit her modern minimalist aesthetic. "Oh, hey, Evelyn," Chloe said, not even looking up from her phone. "Marcus said I could start updating the place. Hope you don't mind. It just felt a little old, you know?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with that toxic, fake sweetness. She wasn't just redecorating a kitchen. She was trying to erase my entire existence from that house while I was still standing in it. She wanted me to scream. She wanted a catfight. We had an agreement. But agreements aren't legally binding until a judge strikes the gavel. Marcus had 2 weeks to celebrate his massive victory. 2 weeks to plan his new life with Chloe. 2 weeks before the final court hearing, where his hotshot lawyer would finally read the fine print. And I couldn't wait to see the exact moment his world burned down. Leo squeezed my hand, his 15-year-old jaw clenched tight. I looked at the garbage bag. I looked at the gray paint. I took a slow, deep breath, visualizing the heavy steel door of my son's trust fund vault locking into place. I walked over, quietly picked up my grandmother's recipe box from the trash, and turned to Chloe. "Gray is a very fitting color for you," I said softly and walked upstairs. I didn't cry. You don't cry over a house that is already secretly burning to the ground. 2 weeks later, we sat in the conference room of Marcus's lawyer, Richard. Richard was a shark, a high-priced, aggressive bulldog of a lawyer who wore tailored suits and looked at women like they were minor inconveniences. Marcus sat next to him, wearing his new $15,000 Rolex, radiating pure, unadulterated arrogance. I sat across from them with my lawyer, Eleanor. Eleanor, bless her, looked like a substitute librarian. She was quiet, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had a demeanor so incredibly boring that Richard immediately dismissed her as a threat. Perfect. "Let's make this quick," Richard started, leaning forward, steepling his fingers. "My client is prepared to be generous, despite the circumstances. He will retain full ownership of the primary residence, the Sterling Development Corporation, and the 3 vehicles currently in the company's name. In exchange, he is willing to offer a one-time lump sum settlement of $50,000 to assist Mrs. Sterling in her transition. $50,000 for 15 years of marriage, building his company from scratch and raising his child. It was an insult wrapped in a legal threat. If she fights this," Richard added, his voice dropping into a menacing register, "we will drag this out in court for years. We will drain whatever meager resources she has in legal fees. She will walk away with nothing." This was the moment, the performance of a lifetime. I looked down at my hands. I had purposely worn no makeup and an oversized, slightly faded cardigan to look smaller, more fragile. I let my shoulders shake. I forced my breathing to become shallow, rapid. "Marcus, please," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. I looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I helped you build that business. I painted the walls of our first office myself. You can't just throw me out like this. Please, where am I supposed to go with Leo?" Marcus looked at me, and in his eyes I saw exactly what I needed to see. Complete, utter contempt mixed with pity. He was high on his own power. "Evelyn, be reasonable," Marcus sighed, using his patient CEO voice. "I built this empire. You were just there. Take the 50 grand. It's more than you deserve. Don't make this ugly for our son." Eleanor, playing her part beautifully, leaned over and whispered to me, loudly enough for Richard to hear, "Evelyn, if we go to trial, he might try to take custody to avoid paying child support. We don't have the funds for a protracted war. I buried my face in my hands. I let out a soft, broken sob. For 3 long minutes, the room was silent, one save for the ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock in the corner. I let Marcus marinate in his absolute victory. I let him feel like a god. Finally, I wiped my eyes, looking utterly defeated. I looked at Eleanor and nodded weakly. Okay, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Okay, I'll sign. Just let me keep my personal bank account and my grandmother's things. Let him have the house. Let him have the business. Let him have it all. Richard smirked, a triumphant, ugly little smile, and immediately began sliding the preliminary agreements across the table. Marcus didn't even read them. He just wanted to lock in his prize. He signed his name with grand, sweeping strokes. I picked up the pen. My hand was trembling, but not from sadness. It was the adrenaline. As I signed my name, relinquishing my rights to the house, the business, and the cars, I knew something they didn't. Attached to the final divorce decree, the one that would be presented to the judge in 2 weeks, was a standard, deeply boring addendum called the Liability Disclosure Statement. It clearly stated that whoever took full ownership of the assets also assumed full, unshared responsibility for any and all liabilities attached to them. Marcus thought he was signing for a $4 million empire. In reality, with one stroke of his Mont Blanc pen, he had just legally bound himself to $3 million in toxic debt, mortgages, and hidden loans. And by legally separating our finances at this table, he had permanently walled off my $500,000 trust fund. I set the pen down. Thank you, Evelyn, for finally being realistic, Marcus said, checking his Rolex. Chloe was probably waiting for him at a reservation he couldn't afford. I looked at him, my tears completely gone. You're welcome, Marcus, I said softly. You got exactly what you asked for. We had an agreement, but agreements aren't legally binding until a judge strikes the gavel. Marcus had 2 weeks to celebrate his massive victory, 2 weeks to plan his new life with Chloe, 2 weeks before the final court hearing, where his hotshot lawyer would finally read the fine print, and I couldn't wait to see the exact moment his world burned down. Thursday, October 14th, 9 a.m., courtroom 4B. I will remember the smell of that room for the rest of my life. Lemon polish, old paper, and impending doom. Marcus arrived looking like a king stepping up to his throne. He was wearing a custom navy suit, his hair perfectly styled, the stolen Rolex gleaming on his wrist. Chloe wasn't allowed past the gallery, but I saw her sitting in the second row, tapping her designer heels, already planning how to spend the money I had supposedly left on the table. I wore the same faded cardigan. I kept my eyes fixed on the wooden table. Judge Patricia Holden was presiding. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had seen every dirty divorce trick in the book. She adjusted her glasses, looking over the final settlement agreement that Richard had proudly submitted. Mr. Sterling, Judge Holden's voice echoed in the quiet room, you are assuming 100% ownership of Sterling Development Corporation, the primary residence, and all associated physical assets. You are offering a one-time lump sum of $50,000 to Mrs. Sterling. Is this correct? Marcus stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Yes, Your Honor. I believe it's a very generous offer to help Evelyn transition. The judge stared at him for a long, uncomfortable second. Then she turned to me. Her eyes softened with a mixture of professional duty and genuine human pity. Mrs. Sterling, she said gently, you are entitled to half of the marital estate. You helped build this company. By signing this final decree, you are walking away from millions of dollars. Have you been coerced into this agreement? Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Marcus shot me a warning glare from the corner of his eye. Don't ruin this, his look said. I stood up slowly. I let my voice tremble just a fraction. I'm sure, Your Honor, I just want peace. I want Marcus to have everything he asked for. The judge sighed, a heavy, tired sound. Very well, counsel, please review the final addendums before we execute the decree. This was it. The fuse was lit. Richard, Marcus's shark of a lawyer, casually picked up the thick stack of papers. He flipped past the asset division, the house, the company, the cars. He looked smug. Then, his finger turned the page to the liability disclosure statement, the document my quiet, boring lawyer Eleanor had legally mandated be attached. I watched Richard's face. I didn't blink. I wanted to memorize this exact moment. First, his eyes stopped moving. Then, his brow furrowed in confusion. He flipped back a page, then forward again, as if hoping the words would magically change. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. "Wait," Richard whispered. The smugness vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. He leaned in close to Marcus, his hand physically shaking as he pointed to a column of numbers. "Marcus, what is this?" he hissed, loud enough for the microphone to pick up slightly. "What's what? Just let her sign it," Marcus hissed back, annoyed by the delay. "No, you idiot, look at the schedule." Richard's professional facade was cracking. He frantically flipped through the pages. "You didn't disclose this to me. 3 hidden mortgages on the house, a $1.5 million line of credit drawn against the company, $300,000 in crypto margin calls. Marcus, you're assuming all the assets, which means under Section 4, you are legally assuming sole responsibility for all attached liabilities." Marcus froze. He finally looked down at the paper. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the numbers. $3 million in toxic, callable debt. Debt he had secretly accumulated. Debt he thought he could slowly pay off by draining my inheritance once the divorce was settled. But my inheritance was gone, locked in a trust, and by demanding I take nothing, he'd completely insulated me from the fallout. His net worth wasn't $4 million. It was negative $3 million, and he was out of cash. "No," Marcus breathed, his voice cracking. The polished CEO mask shattered into a million pieces. He stood up, knocking his heavy oak chair backward with a loud clack that made Chloe jump in the gallery. "No, this is a trick! She's trying to trap me!" Marcus yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Your Honor, I want to withdraw the agreement. I want an audit. She's committing fraud." Judge Holden slammed her gavel. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. "Order! Mr. Sterling, control yourself!" she commanded. "She lied!" Marcus screamed, his face turning a blotchy, desperate red. She hid these debts." Eleanor, my seemingly boring lawyer, stood up slowly. She adjusted her glasses on her chain. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with ice-cold legal precision. "Every single debt listed was accrued by Mr. Sterling himself. The signatures on the loans are his. Furthermore, opposing counsel waived the right to a pre-trial financial discovery because his client, Mr. Sterling, was in a rush to finalize." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. The waiver Marcus had signed to speed up the divorce so he could be with Chloe. Richard put his head in his hands. He knew it was over. He had let his client sign a financial suicide note because they were both too arrogant to read the fine print. The judge looked at the waiver, then looked at Marcus with a stare so cold it could freeze the sun. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "You demanded these assets. You refused discovery. You signed the preliminary agreements. There is no fraud here, only your own extreme negligence. You cannot unsign a contract just because you finally bothered to do the math." "You can't do this," Marcus begged, actually begging, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. "I'll be bankrupt. I'll lose everything." "You should have thought of that before you demanded everything," Judge Holden replied. She picked up her pen and signed the final decree. Bang! The gavel struck the block. Judgment entered. The marital estate and all attached liabilities are awarded to the petitioner, Marcus Sterling. Mrs. Sterling is awarded her separate property and the $50,000 settlement. We are adjourned. The room erupted. Marcus was hyperventilating, grabbing Richard by the lapels of his suit, screaming about appeals. In the gallery, Chloe was staring at Marcus in horror, realizing her sugar daddy was actually a sinking ship made of debt. She didn't walk towards him. She turned around and practically ran out of the courtroom doors. I slowly stood up. I buttoned my faded cardigan. I picked up my purse. As I walked past the defense table, Marcus grabbed my arm. His grip was weak, desperate. His eyes were wide with a terror I had waited 3 long years to see. "Evelyn, please," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "Please, I have nothing." I looked down at his hand, then up at his tear-stained face. All the fake submissiveness, all the calculated tears, all the forced smiles of the last 3 years melted away, leaving only the sharp, unbreakable woman my grandmother raised. I leaned in, just inches from his ear, and whispered, "You wanted the empire, Marcus. Have fun ruling the ashes." I turned, walked out of the heavy oak doors, and stepped into the bright, warm sunlight of my brand new life. But the story didn't end at the courthouse steps. Because when a narcissist loses everything, the real show is watching how fast their enablers abandon them. The collapse of Marcus Sterling didn't happen in slow motion. It happened all at once. When a ship is sinking, the rats are always the first to flee. By the time Marcus managed to stumble back to his mansion, that afternoon, Chloe was already gone. She hadn't just packed her designer clothes, she had taken the espresso machine, the expensive artwork, and anything else that wasn't bolted down. She left a single pink sticky note on the gray granite counter. I can't do broke. Wise, good luck. Without my inheritance to drain, Marcus had zero liquidity to cover the margin calls and the massive loan payments. Within 30 days, the banks came knocking. It was a domino effect of pure, unadulterated karma. The real estate company's accounts were frozen. The vendors he owed money to filed massive lawsuits. The bank foreclosed on the multi-million-dollar mansion. The luxury cars were repossessed right out of the driveway in broad daylight, in front of all the country club neighbors he had spent years trying to impress. Within 3 months, Marcus Sterling, the man who had demanded an empire, was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. He lost every single thing he had tried to take from me, and the sweetest piece of collateral damage? His mother, Lorraine, the woman who had treated me like dirt, who had bragged to her book club about how her son was keeping everything, suddenly found herself with a 41-year-old bankrupt son living in her guest bedroom. She actually had the audacity to call me. She left a tearful voicemail talking about family and asking if I could help Marcus get back on his feet, hinting at my grandmother's inheritance. I didn't call her back. I just blocked the number. Some bridges aren't meant to be repaired. They are meant to be watched as they burn. While Marcus was drowning in the ashes of his own arrogance, I was busy building a life. I bought a beautiful, modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It wasn't a mansion, but the walls weren't built on lies. One evening, after the dust had completely settled, I sat down with my son, Leo, in our new living room. He had watched the entire empire crumble. He had seen his father's true colors. I handed him a thick manila folder. Inside was the documentation for his irrevocable trust. Over $500,000, safe, growing, and completely untouchable by his father's creditors. Leo read through the papers. He looked up at me, his 15-year-old eyes filled with an understanding far beyond his years. You knew, he whispered. You knew for 3 years, and you just let him think he was winning. I had to make sure you were safe, Leo, I told him, smoothing his hair. I had to make sure he couldn't take your future down with him. Leo didn't say anything for a long time. Then he leaned over and hugged me. It was the tightest, most genuine hug he had given me in years. You're a genius, Mom, he said softly, and for the first time in a decade and a half, I actually felt like one. I used the $50,000 settlement to start my own boutique interior design firm. The dream Marcus had told me was too small for his grand vision. My first big project? Renovating my own kitchen. I painted the cabinets a beautiful, warm sage green. Sometimes, late at night, I sit at my kitchen island with a cup of tea. I look at my grandmother's wooden recipe box sitting proudly on the counter. The house is quiet. There is no tension. There are no lies. There is no one making me feel small in my own home. People think the best revenge is destroying someone, but they're wrong. The best revenge is stepping out of the way, letting them destroy themselves, and using the silence they leave behind to build a life so beautiful, they aren't even a memory anymore. My name's Evelyn, and I have absolutely everything.